Well, good morning, everyone. I'd like to welcome all of you to the kickoff event for the National Academy of Social Insurance's 2020 Robert M. Ball Award Campaign for Social Insurance. My name is Bill Arnone. I'm the Chief Executive of the Academy. Joining me this morning is our Chair, Bill Rogers, and a member of our Board of Directors, Kalolo Kijakazi. We want to get us off to a stimulating start in reflecting on where we are today and talking about all the different social insurance issues that are within the Academy's scope of work. So, Bill, let me turn it over to you for some opening comments. Bill?
Great. Thank you, Bill. And good morning to everyone. I first want to really offer my thanks to our staff, to Bill, to our funders for creating what I think will still be, and even hopefully much more, be a very stimulating and thought-provoking day, but also giving us the opportunity to still, in a wonderful way, celebrate this year's recipients of the Ball Award, Jacob S. Hacker and Virginia Reno, as all of our friends we know Regina. It's an understatement to say that a lot has changed over the last few months, over the last few years. As many of you know, today was originally the date of the 2020 Ball Award banquet. But I think similar to many of you who are part of other organizations, that trying to get everybody together physically was just not going to be able. We kept up hope. We prayed on it, but we're going to make the best out of the situation. And so, by early March, we knew that this traditional event was not possible. But in this historic year, we still have to give the award, and we have more to do. So for the first time ever, we're doing a 2020 Ball Award campaign for social justice. What does this mean? It means that we're still going to recognize the outstanding contributions of Virginia and Jacob, the 2020 recipients, but we're also using this tradition of the Ball Award to reinforce and strengthen what we have always known, but has become even more acute in recent months. Our nation needs a stronger social insurance infrastructure. Strengthening our system means addressing how we have fallen short thus far, including in terms of racial inequality, particularly racial inequality and ethnic inequality and gender inequality. But the focus today is largely going to be around race. We have made too little progress reducing economic security or insecurity. Persons of color, as shown in Academy work, our members' work, they face the greatest economic risk. So throughout the day, we'll be talking about what it takes to realize a stronger society, a fairer society, a just society for all. Today, we aim to provide you with fresh ideas and inspiration, as well as hearing from you and having you being a partner in this conversation. And so because of that, we really appreciate your participation and support. At 4 p.m. This afternoon, we will have a session on what a reimagined social insurance system might look like. My colleague and friend from over many, many years, Bill Spriggs, who is also a recipient of the 2016 Ball Award, will be leading that discussion. Throughout the day, we're collecting suggestions for that session. We want your questions, and the question we want just to start to stimulate what you might suggest to us is, how have you been concerned about particular groups and/or life contexts that expose vulnerability and lack of protection? Please submit your ideas for the panelists to explore the potential and challenges of expanding social insurance to meeting them. So let me turn it back over to my good friend, Bill Arnone.
Bill, thank you very, very much. I think, as many of you probably know, the Ball Award is the major fundraising vehicle for our Academy. And very often the people who donate to the Academy, and of course all of you members who pay your dues, often ask the question, what does the Academy use the money for? And the answer is, there are a lot of things we do that maintain flexibility for us that are not dependent on foundation grants and contracts. One example is the series of COVID-19 virtual roundtables that the Academy has been conducting. Those are all supported by member dues and donations. And then we have projects like our study panels that the bulk of that work is funded by foundations and contracts with agencies and organizations, but gets supplemented because of the donations of folks like you. So please continue to support the Academy. Throughout the day, we'll be giving you reminders of what you can do to support us, but we rely very heavily on what we call those types of funds. Hope you'll all be able to stay with us the bulk of the day, but if you're an in and outer and you're only going to be able to join us for a couple of more segments, I encourage you to join us at 5 o'clock. We're going to have our Social Insurance Appreciation Hour. That does require a ticket. You can still get a ticket to join, and we will be able to toast Jacob Hacker and Virginia Reno and kind of end the day on an uplifting note. If you do donate now for that 5 o'clock session, you'll get an email with the Zoom link for it. So we hope you'll all be able to join us once again by the end of the day. There's a lot of things to think about in today's environment, and we're going to have speakers joining us in a moment to reflect on different aspects of social insurance, and particularly what they mean for the issues of racial injustice that are at the forefront of our country's conversations in these very trying times. So you will see opportunities to talk very substantively about these issues. We do have a fundraising goal, and the goal is to raise $100,000 by the end of the Academy's fiscal year, which is June 30th. So we hope, again, you'll be able to put us much closer to the goal. Thank you to all of you who already purchased tickets. Thank you to our funders who will be joining us throughout the day for sponsoring the Academy's Ball Award campaign. If you go on our website, you'll find an up-to-date list of those who have sponsored us. In fact, there is a good example of the upcoming program. It's a very robust program that we're kicking off today. For those of you who are Zoom veterans, you already know how to participate. For those of you who are not, the chat box at the bottom of your screen is the vehicle for you to chat among yourselves and also to pose questions to people who will be speaking. And we encourage you to do that. We want this to be as interactive a day as possible. So please take full advantage of the chat box. We are closed captioning the recording of today's sessions, and we'll be making this available on our website after the event is over. And if you go on our website now, you'll see the full agenda for the planned activities that we're hoping to have throughout the year of 2020. Today's virtual kickoff is a kickoff, and we hope we can return to in-person event to honor Jacob and Virginia sometime in the fall. We hope. I say hope because no one knows with the pandemic what its future course is going to look like. But if things get back to some level of acceptable risk, the only way I can put it, we'll try to have some event in the fall. It might be an outdoor event. We'll keep all of you who've been kind enough to purchase tickets apprised about what our plans are going forward. So if you have your coffee ready, I've got this triple energy iced coffee, which is so good, I'm able to get access to Zoom without being on it. So it's a very high-powered coffee. Hope you'll all join me in it. So Bill, I just want everyone to know, Bill has served as our chair for the past few years, continues to be our chair. And the key to the Academy's success is always a good relationship between the chair of the board and the staff, including myself as the executive. And I do have to be honest, Bill, we've had to overcome a significant obstacle in order for Bill and me to form a very positive relationship. and that has to do with most of us being baseball fans. Um, for some reason, Bill is a fan of, get ready, folks, the Houston Astros. After 2017, I call them the Houston Asterisks. But I, as most of you by now know, am a fanatic Dodger fan. So Bill and I have had to overcome that obstacle. I think, Bill, would you agree? I think we've been able to do that.
Yeah, especially when you paid up on your dinner that you owed me after the World Series that year.
Yes, thank you for reminding me of that. But Bill, did you ever think, here we are in late June, that we could actually say our teams are undefeated? Isn't that a great thing to say?
Yes, and they still have a chance, right? Everybody's got a chance.
Yeah, although if I had a bet, it's not looking good for Major League Baseball. I think it may be a season we will have to forget. But it's a reflection of the times we're in. I mean, just think at the start of 2020, if someone said to you, within the first half of the year, we will have a pandemic that will kill over 100,000 Americans and uh, hundreds of thousands worldwide. And if that's not enough, we'll have a serious recession, which, remember the old saying, Bill? It's a recession when others are out of work. It's a depression when you're out of work. So for 40 million Americans, it's a depression. And added to it, this horror show of violence against people of color that's causing the entire country to react with protests and statements like we issued and commitments to finally do what we didn't do. Each time we're reminded of the suffering that our society and our economy poses to people of color. You would have said, look, any one of those will be bad, but all three, it's just unimaginable.
Unimaginable, but if you connect the dots, right? If you connect the dots that something of this nature was on the horizon, right? You go back to the early 1980s, and where there was the beginning of the erosion, continuing erosion in many of our institutions, right? Unions, in particular. These an important institution that helps to not only people to organize collectively and bargain for wages, but also job safety, right? The workplace environment. And we began in other institutions, such as the government, with the minimum wage. It became harder to keep that floor, right, it was made harder to keep that floor moving up. So, and that led to this sort of growth in income inequality. That sort of led to a growth in income inequality starting in the 1980s, and it continued to expand. The 1981-82 recession at that time was the worst recession actually for African Americans since World War II. And some work that myself and others had done, that it basically took a decade for young Black men to their earnings to catch up to those of their white peers. So, and if you take it, we sort of march on through the 1990s. You had a period of time where we did grow together a bit. We had a strong economy, but still on net over this period, there's been a dismantling of our social insurance infrastructure and other strong institutions that help families, help communities, help individuals maintain a level of economic security. And so we went into the Great Recession. Many of our social insurance infrastructure, such as the unemployment insurance system, right, had not been repaired. We were financing tax cuts in many states using GUI trust funds. So you know, the dots are there if you're willing to be aware and connect them. And so we came out of the recession, Great Recession, and began, and it was a third jobless recovery. Right, there's all this stuff that just pulled together to where when the pandemic hit, people were really, really vulnerable. As our one of our awardees, Jacob Hacker, he talked about this, even identifying a lot of this, what he called it the Great Risk Shift, and so the vulnerability is increased, but also the ability to be resilient to these types of changes, to these types of shocks, has been eroded. So if you do connect the dots and you're aware, and which means that we could have done something. We really could have done things.
So we'd like to set that tone of candor in the discussion we're going to have this morning. So you've provided a great introduction. Kilolo Kijakazi has joined us. Kilolo serves on the Academy's Board of Directors, has been a longtime supporter of us, starting with her days at the Ford Foundation. And we're going to have other speakers. Shelby Gonzalez. I saw Shelby's face very briefly. I hope she rejoins. And Henry Aaron is going to join us, and we hope Josie Calipini. We're asking each of our guests, there's Josie, good morning, Josie, to just weigh in from the perspective, particularly of racial injustice, what different social insurance programs have done, and quite frankly, what they have not done to provide more economic security for people of color. So Kilolo, let's start with you. You've done path-breaking research on Social Security and Black Americans. Just talk a little bit about some of your top-level findings.
Thank you, Bill, and thank you, Bill Rogers. As you indicated, prior to the onset of the COVID pandemic, workers of color typically faced higher rates of unemployment and were paid lower wages than white workers. And too often, researchers, policymakers, the media, and the general public attribute these racial disparities to a lack of education held by people of color. But when the evidence shows that structural barriers in the labor market, including racial and gender discrimination, result in African Americans facing greater economic insecurity during their working lives and in retirement. The data show that when you examine unemployment by level of education, African American workers typically face higher rates of unemployment than white workers at every level of education. So whether you're talking, if you compare people with high school diplomas, African Americans have higher rates of education. But if you're talking about people with PhDs, still African Americans have higher rates of unemployment than white workers. The same is true for wages. African American workers are paid less than white workers at every level of education. In addition, African American workers are paid less than white workers in every occupation. The duration of unemployment is longer for African American workers, and they are also more likely to hold part-time jobs when what they really want are full-time jobs. African American women experience both racial and gender discrimination. And the Institute for Women's Policy Research estimates that at the current pace of progress, it will take a century for African American women to reach pay equity with white men doing comparable jobs. As a result, older African Americans have received substantially less in lifetime wages compared to white workers. Racial and gender discrimination in the labor market affect whether workers will have access to employer-sponsored retirement savings plans and whether they will have sufficient earnings to contribute to those plans. In addition, years of work and wages are used to determine Social Security benefit levels. Consequently, benefits for African American families are substantially lower than those for white families. Even after receiving Social Security, African American families are more likely to experience poverty than white families. The COVID pandemic and the resulting economic disruptions will likely exacerbate these labor market barriers that are faced by workers of color. Workers of color who lost their jobs due to the pandemic and those who were unemployed before the pandemic are likely to face greater barriers than white workers in getting jobs and equitable wages during the recovery. Occupational segregation is another barrier which results in workers of color being disproportionately steered to service sector jobs rather than professional and management jobs. During the pandemic, essential workers such as employees of public transportation, the postal system, and home health care workers have been more likely to be exposed to the coronavirus. These workers are disproportionately people of color. The higher rate of infection and death for workers of color is driven in part by these structural barriers in the labor market. As a result of higher rates of unemployment, lower rates of pay, less access to retirement benefits, and increased likelihood of exposure to the coronavirus and the subsequent loss of income for their families, workers of color and their families are at greater risk of economic insecurity in retirement. As we develop policies for recovery from the pandemic, it is essential to eradicate racial and gender discrimination in the labor market. If not, we will perpetuate inequities that will continue to leave workers of color and their families at risk of economic security in retirement. In addition, numerous organizations and commissions have proposed changes in the Social Security program to improve benefits and to strengthen the program's financing. The basic minimum benefit was proposed by the Commission on Retirement Security and Personal Savings, and it would give beneficiaries who earn low Social Security benefits a supplement on a sliding scale, starting when they reach full retirement age. This proposed policy is projected to close the Social Security income gap between African American seniors and white seniors in the bottom income quintile by 2065. And poverty rates would fall by 47% for African American seniors and 41% for white seniors compared with rates under the current law. Caregiver credits for up to 5 years have been proposed for parents either out of the labor market or working part-time due to caregiving. And such benefits are particularly important in light of the pandemic. Projections by the Social Security Administration show that in 2050, 33% of African American workers and 20% of white workers would receive higher benefits. In addition to improving benefit adequacy, it will be important to strengthen the Social Security program's financial health because Social Security is facing a long-term financial shortfall. One proposal is to gradually raise the maximum amount of wages that are subject to the Social Security payroll tax, and until that share reaches 90% of national wages. Currently, workers are required to contribute payroll taxes on earnings of up to almost $138,000, which is about 83% of the national wages. Workers who earn less than this contribute payroll taxes on all of their earnings, but workers with the highest earnings only pay taxes on a portion of their earnings. The proposal would substantially increase the share of high wage earners contributing payroll tax on all of their wages, and it would improve equity. I'll stop there.
Well, Kalolo, thank you. That's giving us the complete landscape of many social insurance programs and how they are failing in many ways to achieve economic security for so many. And yet, we cannot overlook the fact that they have made a significant difference. Many of the issues you raised on our website, we have further explorations. In particular, you touched on unemployment insurance. We have a whole new posting on our website on how unemployment insurance has failed, particularly workers of color. So I encourage people to go to our website for more information. I would like to see if we can bring Henry Aaron and Shelby Gonzalez and Josie Calipini screens up because we'll be asking all of them to speak. Josie, Henry, and I hope Shelby will be there. Henry, let's, if I may, let's start with you. Henry and I had the good fortune to be on the founding board of our beloved academy, and we spent time with the person for whom the award is named, Bob Ball. So Henry, if you wouldn't mind talking a little bit about what Bob had said to you and others, particularly about Medicare's role in desegregating Southern hospitals, and then talk more about some key issues from your perspective. So, Henry, let me turn it over to you.
Well, it was indeed a privilege to be part of the group that founded this organization. How many years ago is it exactly? It's a long time. I had darker hair and you had more of it at the time.
Thank you very much, Henry.
It was Bob's vision that the National Academy of Social Insurance could provide for the next generation, I'll put it bluntly, what he and a small cadre of folks had done during the founding generations of social insurance, Social Security in the United States. He noted that there was a dropping off of understanding of the various programs, and I think a failure to understand the importance that Social Security, Medicare, and other programs played in redressing, to a degree, the measure of inequality that existed at the time and has regrettably only grown worse since. Social Security by itself is the single most effective anti-poverty program the federal government runs. Lifts more people out of poverty than any other program. And if you don't believe me, I refer you to the Census Bureau, who documents it every year. That's in a kind of broad income sense, but there were more specific ways in which social insurance dealt with inequality, as you referred to or alluded to when you introduced me. In his memoirs, Bob recounts the fact that the enactment of Medicare faced very considerable opposition through successive Congresses. And although it had been proposed in one form or another for quite a long time. And the reason, or a reason, for the failure of enactment was that the Southern Committee chairman, who dominated Congress at that time in the 60s and even later, recognized that if the federal role in the management of healthcare increased, there was a genuine threat to segregation in the South. They were right. There was a very real threat to it. And one of the aspects of Bob's memoirs that I found most striking and informative, because I had not been fully aware of it, was that Medicare effectively, at least in law, if not always in practice, desegregated Southern hospitals. It was a condition for participation in the Medicare program. And I might add, that was a good deal better than the initial rollout of Social Security itself, the old age and survivors pension system, which in its first enactment, through design, didn't apply to most African Americans. It didn't apply because agricultural workers were excluded, and that meant many, if not most, African Americans in the South. Didn't cover small businesses because they were considered too fragile to bear the administrative burdens of the Social Security system. This was the handiwork and part of the compromise that led to the enactment initially in 1935 of the Social Security Act. And it took generations for that injustice to be remedied by the extension of benefits to virtually every worker in the United States. So I think it's important to understand that both in the sense of redistributing income, but also in the case of Medicare, in the sense of shaping an important private institution, Social Security has been a constructive force in promoting all kinds of equality, economic as well as racial, that it has not overcome the legacy of inequality that from which the United States suffers and continues to suffer is perhaps not surprising. One program can't do that, but it has been a constructive instrument, and I think will continue to be in the future.
Henry, thank you. I want all of our viewers to know that one part of our campaign for social insurance will be the issuance next month of a compendium of articles by all still living former Ball Award recipients, of whom Henry is one. Henry has drafted, I think, a very insightful and challenging look at social insurance and how it deals with economic and health catastrophes such as the one we're now in. So I hope you'll all look forward to the issuance of that compendium. You mentioned, Henry, that there were these exclusions by design at the beginning of social insurance. Another group that was not covered were domestic workers. And I think that's a good lead into Josie Calapini. Josie also serves on the board of directors of the Academy. She's with one of our real stalwart partners, Caring Across Generations. Thanks to support by the Ford Foundation, the Academy and Caring will be conducting a series of what we had hoped would have been in-person road shows under the theme that Bill Rogers has really led, which is getting the Academy outside of the Beltway and connecting with Main Street. We're going to have to resort to virtual webinars starting, of all places, by the way, Minnesota in July. We picked that way before we had any idea of the horrific events there. But Josie, give us your perspective on caring and caregiving from a social insurance perspective.
Hi, Bill. Thanks for having me today. It's an honor to be here. Haven't had 2 cups of coffee yet, but I'm getting there, so give me a little bit of time. I appreciate the comments from before. They really do lead well to some of my thoughts, particularly in this moment where our country is really being asked to reimagine what fairness and equity and inclusion and opportunity and mobility really look like in equitable way. I think we're in a moment that allows us to really reimagine things differently and really ask ourselves the tough questions about what sort of social contract and values we want to center our work and the future of this country on, the future of generations on. It's both a heavy time as a Black woman in this country, in this world, really thinking about both policy work and community work, thinking about the livelihoods and well-being of Black families. I think it's, in moments, it feels like a privilege to talk about social insurance programs and to talk about the future of policy in communities that don't feel safe from day to day. And yet I'm clear that we can't stop imagining what the possibilities of tomorrow hold. And what these moments of agitation and frustration and really deep loss for our communities mean for what we have to imagine in regards to our social safety nets. I think, as Henry said, it warrants noting, and for all of us in our communities to hold, that many of the social insurance programs that we do uphold as true anti-poverty programs were founded on exclusions that left out workers. They left out workers like farm workers, like domestic workers, and other sectors of caregivers, and most of whom are people of color. Many are Black, many are women. I think we have to hold that and ask ourselves what that means about iterating forward and improving upon and reimagining social policy. When we think about pay equity, which Kalila mentioned, and wealth and retirement security and health risks, we're talking about desperate impact to the same communities, layered on top of layer of social determinant factors, constantly taking a hit from one area to the next. And caregiving is no different. We're in the midst of a pandemic. The pandemic has turned all of us into caregivers one way or another. And we get to experience the disruptive and exhausting nature of family caregiving that many of the folks of Caring Across talk to on a regular basis way before the pandemic. So we're all now in a moment where we're trying to work and trying to caregive. We're trying to work and manage the day-to-day responsibilities of our household. And because we're now all caregivers in one way or another, we can see the disruptive nature, how hard it is to be on a video call or a meeting without demands being pulled from us, whether it's kids, dropping into a video Zoom, or my mom loves to call and text. She has no regard to whether or not I'm in a meeting. But if she has a question about her health or something that she might need, there's no regard to whether or not I'm working. We also know that many caregivers actually cut back hours from work or turn down promotions or leave work in the work sector altogether. All of this we know impacts current earnings, impacts future earnings, impacts retirement security in negative and detrimental ways, particularly to women of color. And all of this has a lot to do with the need to strengthen our social safety nets, many of which are some of our beloved social safety net infrastructure, such as Medicare, Social Security, that we know play a huge role in retirement security. We also know that social insurance programs, Social Security and Medicare, are some of the core programs to fighting poverty in our country. So the idea that there isn't progress or work that we have accomplished, that we have done, that we need to build upon is just completely false. But we also know that we have to reimagine the way that we're thinking about the future of our country and the future of families. We know that work is changing. We know that the nature of caregiving is changing. And so we have to reimagine what social insurance programs look like in the future. We need to continue to strengthen what works and reimagine new social contracts. And so we have to ask ourselves, especially in this key moment, who is centered and who is included in the reimagining of some of our foundational rights programs. And we have to, as folks in this conversation, folks particularly in this work, we have to ask ourselves who's centered and who is included. What does that mean about the voices that we have at our tables, about how some of the social programs that we're talking about actually work on the ground and need to be changed and improved moving forward? We know that it can't look like the same white, male, able-bodied team that put together some of our foundational cornerstone programs. And so it has to look different. Our country looks different today. And so it has to look different moving forward when we think about how to reimagine some of these programs. Caring across generations, as Bill noted, has it already been a year, Bill, or two? Time feels so strange these days. We were able to support a paper that really looked at what it would mean to reimagine childcare, paid leave, and long-term care and caregiving supports, founded on a social insurance structure. And we call it universal family care. And we know that many families in this day and age can't actually afford to choose between childcare and work, can't afford to choose between the caregiving of loved ones and their own well-being. And we know that we're in a time where we individually and where governments spend their money is judged as a value statement. And so we have to think about what are the needs of our communities? What do programs like universal family care look like for equity? And how do we really think about what our spending, what we demand of our tax dollars, what we demand of how we sustainably finance future programs, what that means as a value statement to us as individuals and to us as a community. Lastly, Bill, before I pause, because I'm excited about some conversation, there's sometimes a lot of conversations about whether or not we center equity. And I just want to challenge us to thinking about this moment as a way of not just centering equity, but as a way of really looking at what it means to center equality over equity. The idea of equity, when we know that many of our populations, many Black communities are starting from behind, the idea of equity and fairness, where we distribute the same amount across the board, doesn't actually lead to lifting of all boats. So what does it look like for us to really reimagine some of our current social safety net programs in a way that centers equality, that centers the most marginalized communities, like people of color, like Black women, like our disabled neighbors, who we know are centered, are really the ones that are figuring it out day to day and likely already have the solutions that we need to strengthen the programs moving forward. As I said, we center caregivers, and we're thinking about what it looks like to really support working caregivers moving forward. And we know that social insurance programs, strengthening the cornerstone programs that we have, and reimagining new programs such as universal family care moving forward, is going to be critical for how we really get to the ideal equal vision that we have for our country.
Josie, thank you very, very much. Josie mentioned the report that the Academy's study panel on universal family care issued in our chat section. For those of you who are watching, there's a direct link to that report, which represents what we call at the Academy new frontiers of social insurance, going beyond the current core programs like Social Security, Medicare, workers' compensation, unemployment insurance. What are some other risks that cry out for a social insurance approach that are not currently covered? And universal family care, which does include long-term services and supports, in the news a lot in view of this pandemic and the terrible impact it's had on residents of nursing homes. It's all covered in that massive study that we're very excited about. It continues to be an Academy priority. And thanks, Josie, for your leadership in helping us focus on that aspect of social insurance. At 4 o'clock today, we'll have what a reimagined social insurance infrastructure might look like. I encourage all of you to take advantage of what I think will be a very stimulating session at 4 o'clock. One other group that is often overlooked in our social insurance infrastructure are immigrants. And we're really thrilled that Shelby Gonzalez has joined us from the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. Shelby's a relatively new member of the Academy. Shelby, welcome, and we look forward to your perspective on the issues we've been discussing. I'll turn it over to you, Shelby.
Thank you. And good morning, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to speak today about the challenges that immigrants and their families are facing. The pandemic has been shining a light on the inequities that many immigrants have faced for many years, well before COVID. Now, immigrants and their families are being especially hard hit due to the pandemic. And I could talk about this for hours, and I promise, Bill, I will not be talking about it for hours. But I am going to focus on three specific issues that are creating a really devastating situation for many immigrants and their families. First, there are longstanding eligibility restrictions that prevent immigrants from gaining access to public benefits and services that help people make ends meet when they face challenging times. And we can all agree these are challenging times. For example, most lawful permanent resident adults are barred for 5 years from accessing food assistance through SNAP, what we used to call food stamps, and they can't get Medicaid to cover their health insurance and health coverage needs. Second, many immigrants and their families are afraid to interact with the government altogether out of fear that if they do, a family member may get deported, or later they won't be able to change their immigration status to become lawful permanent residents, which we oftentimes refer to as green card holders. Immigrants and their families are afraid in large part because the Trump administration has radically changed what's known as the public charge rule. For decades, the public charge policy has been part of the screening process that people would undergo when they applied for an immigration status to either come to the United States under a lawful status or to change their immigration status within the United States. The public charge test has been used to make sure that immigrant applicants don't later become mostly reliant on the government for subsistence. The Trump administration radically changed how public charge is assessed. The standard that was adopted in this rule is so extreme that if it were applied to US citizens, their actual use of public benefit programs would make it very difficult for about half of US citizens when we look at their participation, their actual participation in the benefits that are reviewed or considered as part of this over about a decade's time period, more than a decade. So those changes will mean that people with low or modest incomes will be turned down when they apply to become come to the United States to either reunite with their families or to change their status within the United States to stay with their families. Many people who are in some way related to immigrants are concerned that if they access any of the programs that I've mentioned, another member of their family won't pass the public charge test, even though that in reality is not the case. When an individual goes through a public charge assessment, what is being reviewed in terms of the aspect of a public charge assessment is only looking at use of benefits for the individual who is seeking a new immigration status. Now, there's many other factors that are also reviewed, and many of those other factors would make it extraordinarily difficult for somebody with low or modest income to pass. So what's happening is that there is a lot of fear and confusion about this rule. And as a result, many children who are born in the United States and are US citizens, their families are afraid to access critical supports like healthcare or food assistance. And as you can imagine, in this very difficult environment, this is really devastating as families are going without these needed services, and it's difficult to know what that means in terms of people delaying or being deterred altogether from getting important testing and treatment. Third, and finally, the COVID relief packages that have been enacted so far have left immigrants and their families out in some places, or left large gaps or barriers in others. Again, I could go on for a very long time describing these omissions and gaps, but I'll limit myself to two. First, many immigrants and their families, including US born children, weren't eligible to get the stimulus payment. In cases where families included a taxpayer who filed their taxes with an individual tax identification number as opposed to a social security number, the whole family, including the US born children, did not get a relief check. Second, while the relief packages that were enacted created testing and treatment options for uninsured, many immigrants have been confused about where to seek care and if they qualify. For example, providers treating the uninsured have been told to request social security numbers from individuals they serve. If individuals can't provide social security numbers, then they're asked to provide government ID. And many immigrants who are undocumented cannot produce this type of information. So they don't feel like they can receive care. There are other barriers that also present for families and that are more likely to present for families that include immigrants. For example, we've heard a lot about the lack of translation services that help people navigate and figure out where these services are made available within communities, which can also create significant barriers. So we hope to see improvements in these and other areas in future pandemic legislation. And with that, I'll stop. And I'll be glad to answer questions during the Q&A. Thank you again for having me.
Thank you, Shelby. And let me again thank you, Kilolo, Henry, and Josie for really getting us off to a perfect start as we explore.
Just one point.
Sure, Henry.
One group that has not been mentioned. The other day I was taking a look at which counties in the United States had been most severely affected by COVID-19. I was actually initially surprised, but then not surprised at all. The most seriously affected counties are ones in Arizona and New Mexico, inhabited by Native Americans. And as we discuss groups that have suffered from adverse policies by the United States government in the past, I think it's important to recognize that Native Americans continue to be among those most severely burdened by that heritage.
Thank you, Henry. We will have a section at 1 o'clock today on who is left out. So I encourage all of you to join for that discussion as well, because time this morning does not permit us to engage in much interaction as we have to wrap up this morning's session. So thank you again for really, again, getting us off to a terrific start. I do have a responsibility as the Academy's chief executive to constantly remind you of our need for funds to continue our work. So we do have a thermometer that we are going to be monitoring during the day. Our goal for the Academy's current fiscal year, which ends June 30th, is to raise $100,000. Again, this is taking the place of our biggest fundraiser, our in-person ball award event. So all the support you give us really does make up for a gap that we're experiencing. We are at about $65,000 toward the $100,000 goal. I want to thank the Anthem, and you'll be hearing from Merrill Friedman later on today, and AARP for being two of the biggest sponsors to get us to 65,000. We'll be monitoring this thermometer throughout the day and hope that we get close to our goal of 100,000 by June 30th. So thanks for your patience as we make these pitches. More importantly, thanks for contributing to make that thermometer go up and up and up. I hope Renee Landers has been able to join us. Renee is the Academy's vice chair, and she'll be saying a few words to tee up our next section. But right now, let me turn it back to Bill Rogers just for some closing comments and also lead to our next section. Bill?
Bill, thank you. And I want to echo your appeal to getting this thermometer to hit that $100,000 mark. For those who on the board who know me, I talk about the 3 T's, right? It's your time, your talent, and your treasure. And we've had the board at the board level, and we've had a lot of conversation about our requests, particularly during this particular time period. But we've coming forward to you because as this panel and the other panels will really display and in its bareness that we need your help. And that we are not atomistic agents that kind of move around and have our being. That we are a part of a larger community, and we have to support each other. One of the things that connects to this that was a takeaway for this recent conversation is that yes, as Kololo talked about, the racism, discrimination exists all throughout various parts of our society. But the thing I took away from the comments is that there are what we call race neutral types of causes for inequality. That you may have a policy that doesn't explicitly isn't racist. There's not an animus for its existence, its creation, its proliferation. But because certain groups are disproportionately in a particular category, when that policy is implemented, it has a disparate impact. So one of the things I know as a board and as a staff, as we were going forward in our work, we were paying particular focus to both types of inequality, whether it's out and out discrimination, but it's also kind of manufactured. And what's been the work that I've done and others have done has shown that there's been this increasing contribution to those race neutral types of reasons for why we're seeing inequality and seeing it persist. So again, thank you for a great panel. Thank you for a great start. Bill, thank you for again stressing the importance that we need your ongoing support, people's ongoing support. So I want to thank our audience for listening, for joining with your coffee, your tea, or your orange juice or cranberry juice. And so I want to shift now to our next session. It's a big think session with our board colleagues, Robert Espinoza, Doug Holtz-Eakin, Jason Fickner, and Renee Landers, who I believe will be leading that conversation. So I believe right now we're going to reset the screen for a few minutes and start the program at 9:30.
And Renee